Me and a couple friends last year decided we wanted to go camping. We wanted to do something we usually wouldn't do, for fun. And this is what we all agreed to. This was completely out of character for us, but it was just us boys, a few tents, and all the food we thought we would need for the weekend. This wasn't your average campground. It was in the middle of the woods, off some back roads in a small town in Tennessee. We're more of suburban kids, so it was a bit of a culture shock for us, but nonetheless, we were excited. Shortly after we arrived and got camp set up, we met some locals who told us something about this place being haunted, and that there were very strange things that happened here during the night only. Something about some sort of beast, or a weird old creepy man? I don't know. I wasn't even listening because I thought it was pathetic. We thought they were just trying to mess with us and joke around or whatever. Of course I didn't believe it. I mean, like, seriously, are you kidding me? I'm not 12. We arrived late afternoon, so after setting up camp there wasn't much to do other than hang out by the fire and drink some beers. We were all having a blast. We started telling each other scary stories for fun, and to add to the camp atmosphere vibe, if you will. We got s'mores and hot dogs out and completely pigged out. After a few hours of being boys and getting absolutely wasted, it was off to bed. We had to wake up early tomorrow morning because we all planned to go fishing at a nearby lake within walking distance. I couldn't sleep right away because I had to pee really bad. I couldn't find my flashlight, so I said to hell with it. I walked over maybe 30 feet from camp and peed by a tree. It was pitch black, and I mean as black as it gets, especially with the fire being almost all the way out. I heard something rustling before me in the woods. Whatever, I thought. It's probably just a bunny or a deer, you know, like something harmless. Even though initially it spooked me, and that was only because it caught me off guard and you can't see a damn thing. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. I made my way back to my tent, got in my sleeping bag while trying my best not to wake anyone up. I tried to fall asleep, but I couldn't. I was having some anxiety, and I'm a light sleeper, so hearing everyone snore was driving me nuts. Within an hour, I started to doze off, but then, all of a sudden, I awoke to rustling in the leaves. It was a lot louder this time, and whatever the hell it was making a very strange noise. Almost what you would expect a wild beast to sound like. Yes, I said beast, because I don't know how else to describe it. I immediately thought of what those locals told us, and I was thinking, no, calm down, I'm overreacting, I told myself. There's no such thing as monsters. Yeah, you could say I was scared shitless, but my friend sleeping next to me woke in a panic as well. What the hell, Darren said. Dude, what is that? Is that a bear? I don't know, but what should we do? We both kind of sat there for a moment while we tried to piece together what the next move was. We didn't want to run, because if that was a bear and it started chasing us in the middle of the night, I don't imagine that would end well for us. I was sitting and I was thinking, well, it's probably smartest for us to just stay in here and wait it out. So that's what we did. We sat there in silence for about an hour, whispering here and there. Darren fell back asleep shortly after, but I still couldn't sleep knowing there was something out there. Call me a wimp or whatever, but I'm sure most of you would be freaking out too. I lied awake most of the night, just like hours of just thinking. I think I dozed off again for a moment, and I heard whatever the hell that thing was again, messing around with some of our belongings at camp this time. It was about morning by now, so there was a little bit more light. I opened my tent, looked outside, and I shit you not, there were 3 black bears looking directly at me. Okay, so it was a monster, just not the type of monster the locals warned me about. They started making their way towards me slowly. I started yelling at them, hey, get back, go away. Guys, wake up, help. Everyone got up slowly, but thankfully a few friends of mine woke up in time. As we were all yelling at them, it didn't take long before the bears ran away. Had I been alone, who knows what would have happened. I'm just thankful my friends were there. We ended up staying another night at camp and the bears didn't come back. That was probably a bit risky, but everyone left unharmed, thankfully. My family and I go camping 3 or more times a year at all different types of campgrounds across the US. This particular time we were in Indiana. I can't remember the city because I was so young, but it was a Yogi Bear Jellystone campground. I love this place to pieces and I've been here over 5 times throughout my life. One of the first times we went, something horrible happened. Keep in mind, I was only a kid at the time. I had made some friends my age at the park. We did all sorts of things. Played basketball, went to the arcade, went swimming and fishing. You name it and we did it. It was a lot of fun and everything was going great. We were staying there for a couple weeks too, so I had lots of time. My friend Jake on this particular evening mentioned that we should take a walk through the trails. Of course I was interested. It was like one of the only things this place had to offer that we hadn't explored yet. As we were exploring the trails, we realized it was a lot bigger than we thought it was, so only shortly after we decided it was time to go back to the campsite. It was getting dark, and park curfew was 9:30 anyway, so we had to head back soon. We waited for our parents to go to sleep for what felt like forever. We decided that it would be fun to go walk through the trails with our flashlights given how dark it was. I know that sounds silly, but we were kids, so I'm sure you can understand why that might sound fun for some crazy teenagers. On our way there, Billy was freaking out because we were breaking the rules, and he was a goody two-shoes, so he wimped out and went back to camp. I wish we all would have done the same because maybe my friend would still be alive. So it was only me, Jake, and Carter. Carter was older than us, so I guess he thought it was funny. He ran away from us and hid. He was just trying to scare us. We spent at least 10 minutes looking for him before he finally jumped out and scared the hell out of us. I was kind of irritated, but we laughed it off. At this point, we had been walking for maybe 20 minutes, not really paying any attention to where we were walking. Jake and I were starting to get worried and hoped we weren't lost. Carter thought it would be funny to continue messing with us, so he ran off and hid on us again. Eventually we got sick of looking for him, so we yelled that we were leaving if he didn't come out. I felt bad for ditching, but I was sick of him messing with us and he knew it. So we turned around and started making our way back. A few minutes after walking, I heard screams. It was Carter. We thought he was just messing around with us still, so we continued walking. A brief moment later, I realized something terrible was happening. He was screaming at the top of his lungs. There's no way he was that crazy or that good at acting. We immediately ran back to our parents. I mean, I've never ran that fast in my life. I told my family what was going on, and we all went looking for him. My mom stayed at the camper and called the police. Park security got involved, and the rangers were giving my dad a hard time and not taking us seriously at all. One ranger was practically hounding my dad the whole time. We couldn't find Carter. We had been searching for over an hour. Nothing. There was no sign of him anywhere. Carter's parents were freaking out and blaming my parents for everything. Eventually they kicked my family out of the park and we weren't allowed back until next year. They never found Carter to this day. I blame myself for his disappearance. The guilt haunts me every single day that I should have done something different. I used to love camping, but I'm completely traumatized from a few years back. I'm not sure if I'll ever go camping again. So here's my story. We went camping one summer, like we always did. I grew up at this campground. Well, not really, but like I've been camping here with my family since I was a baby. In 2016, I was 14 years old. It was our first day camping of the year. Everything was normal, except this time I was a year older and I didn't have any friends with me. I'm not an only child. I do have a little sister, but she's 7 years younger than me. So as you can probably figure, we don't have too much to relate on. I was kind of alone. I would go to the park alone, get ice cream alone. I mean, my parents didn't let me do whatever I wanted all the time, and I did spend time with them too, but a lot of the time it felt like I was alone. I would ride my bike around the campground a lot. That's mainly what I did when I was bored. This campground was pretty big in space, but it's not your typical campground where there are motorhomes, tents, fifth wheels, etc. lined up right after another. There were lots more space in between, filled with tons of trails and all different types of trees. You get it. It was a nice campground. There was a really creepy cabin I used to pass by all the time when I was riding my bike. The cabin was pretty far from my campsite, and pretty far from any other campsite as well. It looked empty, like no one was camping there during that time. One day when I was riding by, I saw that the front door was cracked open. I have rode past this cabin at least 50 times in the past 4 to 5 days, and I knew for a fact there was no one camping there. Or so I thought. Geez, I just wish I never would have gone in there. Of course, my curiosity got the best of me, and I ever so slowly made my way up the couple steps onto the porch and slowly pushed the door forward. It was so eerie because the door was creaking the whole time, probably for like 15 seconds. It was very cringe sounding. Who's there? I stood in complete silence, eyes wide, and my mouth dropped to the floor. The old man standing right across from me told me to come inside and reassured me it was okay. I turned around to leave, and immediately he yelled at me and told me to come back. I took off on my bike and drove away as fast as possible. There was nothing that really happened after that. I don't know what he wanted, but good thing I didn't have to find out. I went home in a panic. I didn't tell my parents because I was too scared. I don't know why, but the next day I drove past the cabin again. There was no sign of him. I know now that he was definitely trying to lure me in, and who knows what he was going to do. I hadn't seen him again until the last day of camping. I was at the arcade playing this basketball game. He came up right beside me and said, "Hey kid, how come you didn't want to hang out?" This guy, I still remember his face. He was really tall, skinny, old, and had long white hair and some beat up old clothes. His teeth were all jacked up and stained yellow as well. He gave me the weirdest smile ever and told me I was a clever little one. He then winked at me and walked away. I've never seen him again after that. We left the campground the next day and I still never told my parents. I don't know why, I just didn't think I needed to. That guy was definitely a predator and was definitely trying to prey on me. It didn't work on me though, and God forbid it doesn't work on anyone else.
I used to love taking my family on camping trips. There was this specific set of campgrounds up in the Catskill Mountains that we used to visit as often as we could during the spring, summer, and fall. But that was ruined for us the last time we were there. At that time in our life, it was just me, my wife Kim, and our daughter Millie, and we couldn't have been more excited to get to our campsite. My plans were simple: set up tents, go on a hike, and then catch some fish for dinner. Sadly, there was a wrench thrown into the mix when I noticed that we weren't alone on the trail that led to the campgrounds that I used. This didn't happen often, but every now and then we would run into fellow hikers or campers, but there was something different about this guy. I don't know what it was, but as soon as I noticed him walking behind us on the trail, I decided to keep Millie and my wife very close to me, and I put myself between them and the man as we walked. After about an hour of hiking, we made it to the place where we were going to set up our tents, and I was happy to see that the man who was following us just kept on walking. As I set up our tents, I tried my best to convince myself that this guy was just a hiker and there was nothing to worry about. And honestly, by about halfway through the day, I had forgotten all about him. The sun started to go down and I began setting up s'mores for Kim and Millie when I could have sworn that I heard something walking around in the distance. I stopped what I was doing and looked around our campsite for a moment to make sure it was clear, and I didn't see anything, so I decided not to worry Kim about it. I finished making us our snacks and then we all continued having fun before bed. I stayed awake for about an hour past everyone just to make sure the fire was actually out and that all of our stuff was put away. But when it was time for me to go to sleep, boy did I pass out. I slept really well for about 20 minutes before I woke up to my wife poking me and whispering for me to wake up. I looked over at her and saw that she looked horrified, and then I looked past her to see that Millie was also awake. My wife caught my attention again and whispered that someone was in our camp. So I listened closely, and sure enough, I could hear someone moving around right outside of our tent. I told Kim to stay in the tent with Millie as I made my way out to see who or what was in our camp, and as soon as I popped my head through the entrance of the tent, I saw who it was. I recognized the man who was following us up the hiking trail earlier that day, and it looked like he was going through our cooler and all of the food that we had left out. Before I could say anything, he noticed me getting out of the tent and immediately dropped the food that he was holding. I tried to calmly ask him what he was doing, but before I could get a sentence out, he charged me and tackled me back toward the tent. We both fell onto the tent, causing my wife and daughter to both scream from inside of it. And I don't know if it was the sound of them screaming or the fact that he didn't mean to fall over with me, but the man was clearly startled after that and simply took off running in the opposite direction. I checked to make sure that Millie and Kim were all right before taking a flashlight and looking around for that guy. I couldn't find him, which means he must have run pretty far away from the camp, but we still didn't feel safe sleeping there. After I got back to our tent, we all decided to pack up, and in the middle of the night started walking back to our car. It was an hour-long hike through the dark woods to our vehicle, and every now and then I swear I heard someone walking behind us. Thankfully, the man never showed his face again, and we managed to make it back to the car without any incident. We made it home early the next morning, and I made sure to report the incident to the owner of the property that the hiking trail and campsite were located on. Sadly, that was our last trip to that campsite. None of us felt it was safe there anymore. Camping alone can be one of the most peaceful experiences of your life, but if you aren't prepared for anything and everything, it can be equally terrifying. I learned that when I was camping by myself in the Rocky Mountains. I had been out there for 2 days, but this time I brought enough provisions to last me the entire week, if not more. It's too bad I didn't even get the chance to use half of them before learning how truly treacherous the wilderness can be. It was the middle of the night on my second day there, and I was sleeping pretty well until I was woken up by the sudden sound of running water. As soon as I opened my eyes and became conscious, I could feel that I was laying in water that was about an inch deep and quickly rising. Even in my tired state, I could tell what was happening. I was caught in the middle of a flash flood, and it was coming in quickly. I knew my best chance of making it out of the situation would be to get out of my tent and then move to the side of the flowing water to hopefully get out of it without being swept away. Sadly, it was too late. As soon as I started to get up, I felt the bottom of the tent being lifted and swayed by the water that was rushing by. And by the time I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, it started to be pulled along with the rushing water. I tried to get my body out of the tent as it started to flip from the force of the water that was quickly rising, and I managed to step out and stand upright. By that point, the water level had risen to where it was just above my knee, and it seemed to be moving even faster now. I tried to make my way over to the edge of the rushing water, but the second I lifted 1 foot, the pull of the water forced me to topple over. I fell face first into the water and tried to get my footing again, but it was like fighting against rapids at that point. That's how fast flash flooding can happen. I guess that's why they call it flash flooding. Before I knew it, I was being swept away just like my tent was. I tried to relax my body and brace for any rocks that I might be smacked into as I followed the flow of the flood, and it helped for the most part. Anytime I came across a small rock, I just sort of rolled off the side of it with the water. That is until I thought the water was calming down. I thought I noticed myself slowing down and decided to try to swim to the side of the flood. But as soon as I did, my leg smacked into a branch or a rock underneath the water, which sent a shooting pain up my entire leg. I cried out in pain before I started trying to swim against the current again. Thankfully, I was right and the flood had been slowing down. I was able to make my way over to the side of the flood bank to land that was only soaked by the rain. I pulled myself out of the water and then tried to get myself far away from the flood in case it spread out further. As soon as I thought it was safe enough to lie down, I did. I needed to take a break and breathe as I figured out what had just happened to me. I was pretty upset with myself for not checking the weather for that week, but ultimately figured that all I could do was make it out of that forest alive. I tried to get up and walk, but my ankle was clearly busted from whatever I had hit under the water, so I couldn't really put much weight on it. I managed to hobble very slowly through the woods until daylight. When I could finally see my surroundings, I could tell that I was heading in the right direction and continued to slowly make my way back to my car. I had to take frequent breaks because of my ankle, but I knew that if I didn't make it out of the woods that night, I might not have made it out at all. It wasn't until almost sundown on the day after the flash flood that I finally found the trail that I had used to get to my campsite. It took me another half hour to get back to my car, and when I did, the first place I went to was the hospital. From there, I was able to call my family and let them know what happened to me and that I was fine. But that was the last time I went camping on my own. I never really was a camping type of person, but my cousins wanted me to go camping for their 19th birthday and I couldn't turn it down. They decided to bring me to a campsite that they had apparently been going to for years. But there were a few red flags for me on the trail. The main fact being that the trail passed through an old campsite that was all torn apart. It looked like a crazy animal had gotten a hold of the tent and everything or everyone inside. But according to my cousins, the tent had been there for years. They said that no one cleaned it up in honor of a camper who had died there, but I thought there was something strange about that. It sort of felt like they were just making that up to keep my nerves from going insane. We continued walking through the woods until we eventually hit a point where I could see a fire pit that had been set up. My cousin said that this was their campsite, and we began setting up for the night. I was the last one to get his tent finished, but by that point, My cousin Marcus had already started the fire, so I was able to just chill. The sun quickly set, and before we knew it, we couldn't see anything around us. All that was visible were the three of us and the fire that sat between us as we talked about old family reunions and parties. It started to get pretty fun, if I'm being honest, but that all went away the moment we heard that scream. We all fell silent as the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs began coming from the woods. I looked at Marcus and asked him what was going on. He said he wasn't sure, and we all continued to listen. My eyes grew wide as I heard the scream again. There were no words, just a loud, blood-curdling scream. We all looked at each other as if none of us knew what we should do. I grabbed my flashlight and started shining it around us as the screaming continued. I began to panic as it started to get louder and louder, as if it was heading right toward us. Then out of nowhere, the screaming faded, but it wasn't followed by silence. I'll never forget the feeling in my bones when I heard the unmistakable sound of an animal growling in the distance. I continued to frantically shine my light around, and my cousins joined in, but no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't find anything despite it sounding as if it was right on top of us. After about 20 minutes, all of the noises started to fade away, but still no sign of the animal that was the cause of it. My cousins and I sat around the fire for the rest of the night in a panicked state, looking around as if something was going to jump out of the woods and grab us. Hours passed, but they seemed like days, and when the sun finally started to shine in the sky, we all couldn't wait to get out of there. We quickly packed our things and started walking back down that trail. Each of us moved slowly as we were all looking around, expecting to see signs of whatever we had heard that night, but there was nothing at all. We made it back to the car and then drove back into town to grab something to eat at the diner. And while we were making small talk with our waitress, we explained to her what had just happened to us, and she told us that her son used to go camping up there and once told her the same exact story. We never did figure out what we were hearing that night, but that was the last time I ever went camping. No one would ever convince me to go again.
One of my all-time favorite hobbies used to be going camping with my dog Blue. Blue is a massive Tibetan Mastiff, and anytime we went camping, it felt like I had my own bear alongside me. We don't go camping much anymore because of two reasons. The first being that Blue is getting old, sadly, and while he loves to go on short walks, he can't handle hiking anymore. The other is because of what we experienced the last time we were out in the woods. We were staying at a small campsite that the locals in our town knew about, but other than that, it was pretty quiet up there. On a good weekend, you could be by yourself the entire time with nature, but usually you would run into one or two people hiking, or who also happened to be spending a night underneath the stars. It was our second night out there. We had shown up on Friday, and it was now Saturday night, and we started to get this really strange smell come wafting into our campsite. At first, I thought it must have been a skunk or something, but then I remembered that Blue loved to chase the small animals. If there was a skunk, he was the idiot that was going to get sprayed after chasing it down. So I figured it couldn't have been an animal. Blue would have been all over it, but I tried not to think too much about it. I was sure the smell would leave. However, after about an hour and a half, the smell hadn't faded at all. In fact, it had gotten much worse. So I decided that I had to look around to see if maybe someone had left some rotting food or something that I might be able to get rid of before the stench became too unbearable. I wasn't able to find anything, so I just decided to put my fire out and try to get some sleep. After falling asleep, everything was fine. I slept through the night with no problems, but when I went outside to begin packing up, I noticed the smell was still lingering. Only now, it sort of smelled like something was burning. I immediately turned my attention to where my fire was, and to my horror, sticking out of the ashes was a charred piece of a person. I freaked out and ran as fast as I could. I called the state police right away and led them to my campsite. They are unsure how long the body had been left there, but it appeared to be a murder victim. And as time passed and more people lit fires on the spot, the ground underneath would heat up and slowly cook the body that was buried in a shallow grave. As far as I know, the police haven't connected the body to anyone or any crime. Then again, I tried to distance myself from the situation after finding the body. Camping hasn't been the same since. Every summer, a couple of friends and I go out on our annual camping trip in the woods near Lake George. We had this amazing spot between two campgrounds that was almost never patrolled, so we basically got to stay for free each year. Aside from one time when we ended up having someone call the police on us, at which time we were told to either go to the campground or leave. They claim it was for our safety. In case something happened, at least the campgrounds would know we paid, and they could know where to start looking. I still think it was just because the campgrounds fuel the economy up there, and they need everyone to pay. Either way, that one run-in with the police didn't stop us from going to our usual spot to avoid any unnecessary spending. One year though, something really strange happened. We all made it up to the campsite and set up our tents and sleeping bags. And as usual, my buddy Dave and I finished setting up first, so we decided to start gathering stuff for a fire. In no time, we had an abundance of sticks, dead branches, and smaller kindling. Things were looking great. Once everyone had finished setting up, we all gathered around the cooler and began to enjoy one of the few times we all get to hang out. As the day went on, we started setting up the small grill that we brought for burgers and corn, and you just have to believe me when I tell you that a meal always tastes better after setting up camp. I can't tell you why, but it's pure bliss. The sun had begun to set, and we were all enjoying our meals. Nothing could be better, but that was when we heard the laughter. It was a deep, raspy laugh, as if it had been coming from someone who had just swallowed a frog or something. At first, I think we all thought it must have been coming from one of us, because no one really reacted. But as soon as we realized that it was coming from the dark woods behind us, we all began looking around frantically. We began asking each other if we really just heard that, and then we just sat quietly for a minute to see if we heard it again, but there was nothing. After a few moments, we just brushed it off. It must have been some weird animal or something, is what we told ourselves. The night went on, and I think we were all just trying to forget the laughing that we heard. But I couldn't shake it. As the time came for all of us to lie down, you could tell we were all reluctant to get into our tents. But eventually, one by one we did. And after about 20 minutes of lying in our respective tents, my eyes shot open as I heard it again. That same laughing sound, only this time it sounded much closer. Whatever it was no more than 10 feet away from the back of my tent. I sat there in silence, just waiting to see if it would go away, or if any of my friends would react, but nothing. We all must have been just frozen with fear as the laughter carried on. I didn't want to risk leaving my tent, so I just clutched onto the knife that I brought with me to cut the fishing line if I got caught, and I sat in my sleeping bag all night. The laughter persisted for what seemed like hours. However, it did eventually fade away, and I didn't hear it anymore that night. The next morning, as soon as I could see sunlight, I opened the zipper to my tent, and immediately my friends followed. We all took one look at each other, and without exchanging words, we began to pack up our stuff. There was no way we were staying in those woods for another second. Needless to say, the following year we stayed at the actual campgrounds. I had just turned 9, and my dad finally had time off during the summer, so we decided to go on a small vacation. We didn't have a lot of money, so we just decided to get a bunch of food and snacks, and then we would go out into the woods down the road from our house and have a little family camp out. As a kid, I loved this idea. The thought of s'mores and roasted hot dogs sounded great. After getting to the place that we decided to stay at, my mom and dad began to set up this big 4-person tent. Realistically, it probably wasn't too big, but to me, it seemed like a cabin. Everything about the setting was perfect. I couldn't have been happier. The night went on, and my dad played his guitar and we all sang songs. I got to hear some stories from when they used to go camping when they were my age. It was all just very peaceful. Looking back on it, it's almost a really fond memory. And I say almost because of what happened next. It had gotten dark, and it was finally time for bed. We all packed into one tent and got into our sleeping bags. I have to admit, I remember being really tired, so I was out like a light. Within minutes, I'm sure I was snoring. However, my deep sleep was disturbed as I heard my parents shuffling around. I opened my eyes to see what was happening, and I saw my dad standing over me, looking out of the corner of the tent screen. That was when I noticed what had him so alerted. I could hear movement outside. My mom noticed my eyes had opened and grabbed my attention. When I looked over to her, she had her finger to her mouth telling me to stay quiet. So I did. I just kept my mouth shut and my ears wide open. After a bit of shuffling, I heard a quiet whisper that sounded like a man's voice. We were all shocked when we heard it say, "How many do you think are in the tent?" I had never seen my father get so angry. Even in the darkness, I could tell his face was blood red. That's when he yelled back at them, "Too many for you. You better get out of here before I pull out the hunting rifle." The only response we heard was the sound of multiple steps of footsteps running away, which was lucky for us because we didn't own a hunting rifle. My dad stayed up the rest of the night as me and my mom tried to sleep. He said it was too dangerous to try to leave at night, so we waited until daybreak and then went home. I'm fairly certain my father filed a police report, but I don't think anything could have actually been done about what happened. I still shudder at the thought of what might have happened if my dad didn't think to lie as he did.
I've never been much of an outdoor person, but the summer after my second year in college, one of my roommates convinced me to go tent camping with him. It was only over the weekends, and I wasn't doing anything anyway, so I said I'd go with him. For the sake of privacy, I'll call him Jake. Now, Jake would go all out. He had a 2014 Jeep Wrangler, the entire back seat filled almost completely with different camping gear. He didn't like to reserve spots at actual campsites, but instead find his own spots, which he said made it more fun. We drove up into the Rocky Mountains for a while, until we found a break in the trees with enough space to fit the Jeep through. We then drove off-road between trees until I pointed out a good spot. We set up a fire pit, chairs, and the tent we'd be staying in for the night. It was already around 7 p.m. and the sun was starting to set. Jake went to the car and pulled out a bag of hot dogs for us to cook over the fire. Real original, I know, but they were an easy meal, and plus Jake wanted to give me the true camping experience, seeing it was my first time. He even brought stuff for s'mores. Although, we never got that far. As we were cooking the hot dogs, this extremely loud female screaming from maybe 300 or 400 feet away echoed out throughout the trees. I looked up and saw Jake's head turn around behind him towards the direction of the screams. At first, there weren't any words we could make out, but then there was a help, a please, and a no, all of them sounding more desperate than the last. Then the loudest, most terrifying scream was abruptly cut off mid-scream. Jake looked back in my direction. The look on his face was pure horror. As far as we knew, the closest man-made structure was the road, and even that was far away. No one should have been out here. Whatever it was that we just heard didn't even matter. We knew we needed to leave as fast as possible. We started frantically throwing things in the back of the Jeep. We stuffed the still fully made tent inside as we closed the door. I tried calling 911 as we started driving back to the road. I had practically no service out there, but somehow still managed to get on the line with an operator. I did my best to explain what we heard. They said they'd send out a trooper as soon as possible. It probably took us twice as long to get back to the road, just because this time we couldn't see anything. Finally, we saw the pavement and stopped for a second. We didn't know if we should wait for the cops or not. That's when we saw a figure walking out from the trees in front of us. He was wearing jeans with an all-black sweatshirt, the hood covering his face. He was dragging something behind him in a heavy sheet or some kind of bag. His head was down, lying almost limp as he walked. He looked over in our direction when blue and red police lights revealed themselves down the road. The man turned his head and started sprinting back into the forest, letting go of the bag. The police saw this and started chasing after him. The bag he was dragging turned out to contain the remains of a 34-year-old woman. We don't know if he was ever caught. So, this happened when I was in middle school. It was summer, and my parents had signed me up for a month-long all-boys summer camp. The campsite was exactly what you're imagining. 6 or 7 small cabins spread out in the forest. There was a small lake, a few fire pits set up, and I think there was even a sand volleyball court if I'm remembering right. It was close to 4 hours out of town. The place was old and run down, but definitely still used often for summer camps. When we got there, I unpacked all my stuff into one of the cabins and set up my bed. Some of the kids I'd be staying with wanted to check out the forest before we'd have to be back for dinner. The rules of the camp were pretty laid back. We were told we could go as far as we wanted, as long as we could still see the cabins. As we were walking into the forest, one of the kids pointed something out, or rather someone. A man who had to be over 50 years old stood a few yards away looking in our direction. He looked almost homeless, really unkempt, dirty clothes, a rough gray beard. We ultimately just assumed he was one of the camp counselors. The guy gave us a weird smile, and I gave him an awkward wave back. We ran back to our cabin, and later that night told one of the camp counselors about it. They took it very seriously, even going out to that part of the woods themselves, but by then the guy was gone. We started to realize that a large portion of the camp counselors were teenagers. No one was older than like 30. They didn't tell us straight to our faces, but it didn't seem like they had any idea who that man was. The next few days, we didn't do much more exploring. We were still pretty creeped out, to be honest with you. It was on the 4th night when things really hit the fan. I was sleeping and woke up to the sound of the cabin door handle rattling. Now, most nights at 11 p.m., one of the counselors would knock on all the cabins to remind the kids to lock their doors and go to sleep. Sometimes we would fall asleep before this, and it would end up waking us up. I thought this is what was happening, but I didn't have any way to tell the time, so I had no way of knowing. Being the only one awake, I felt obligated to yell out a response. I'm pretty sure I yelled out something about how we were already in bed. Right as I did this, a flashlight turned on from outside, and the light started pointing in through the windows. Someone was trying to see inside. By then, a couple of the other kids started to wake up. I remember motioning for them to get down. The person outside went around the cabin multiple times, pointing the light through every window as they did so. I don't know if they saw me, but I do know the light passed clear over me a good couple of times. After maybe 5 minutes, the light finally turned off, and everything once again returned to silence. I explained what happened to the other kids. One of them had a watch and looked at it. It was 4 a.m. That wasn't a counselor. We stayed awake until morning. Finally, one of the teenage counselors came to our cabin to wake us up for breakfast. Right away, we told him what happened, and he stopped. He took us to a couple of the adult counselors where we retold the story. What we heard next was something that truly terrified us. Last night, a kid from a different cabin had gone for a walk to use the bathroom. As he was heading back, he noticed someone at our cabin door. Like us, he at first thought it was a counselor, but questioned this when he saw the person trying to pick the lock. The kid was asked to describe the man. It was dark, however, he remembered him having a beard and wearing dirty clothes. This instantly reminded me of the man we had seen in the forest on the first day. The entire camp immediately got canceled in concern of kids' safety. That afternoon, a bus showed up and took all of us back home. Many years have passed since this happened. I recently did my own research and was able to find a small report on it. Police were called in after we had left. They combed the area and found a small tent nearby. Inside were the essentials, along with hundreds of Polaroid pictures of the camp. The cabins, the canoes by the lake, the fire pits, everything. Among these were pictures of the kids, most of them taken from a distance, or in a place where the man taking them was clearly trying to hide. Most disturbing were the pictures taken at night through cabin windows. The police waited for someone to return to the tent, but no one ever did. The man was never found. It was approaching the end of summer, and my wife and I wanted to go on a camping trip before it started getting cold out again. I had a ton of camping gear left over from when I used to go with college buddies, and wanted to put it back to use. There was one spot we always used to go. It wasn't even technically a camping ground, just a cool spot we had found one time that I thought would be perfect to take my wife. When we got there, we noticed a makeshift fire pit and some trash left behind, so obviously other people had found this spot, but we didn't really care. We set up the tent we'd be staying in and started a fire. We sat around the fire talking and drinking for hours on end. Suddenly, at around 2 a.m., we were interrupted by the sound of a chainsaw starting and revving up. Or at least that's exactly what it sounded like. Our first thought was that someone was cutting down a tree, but we didn't understand why someone would be doing that this late in the night. This theory was quickly thrown out, and this maniacal laughing suddenly followed. Now we were creeped out. We put out the fire and got inside our tent. It sounded distant, so we felt somewhat safe. Plus, we had a machete if it really came to that. Over the next few minutes, it honestly sounded like the noises were getting closer. But thankfully, the engine, or whatever it was, abruptly cut out and a wave of relief overcame us. After a half hour of silence, the two of us felt comfortable enough to try and fall asleep. And surprisingly, we actually did relatively quickly, most likely in part due to the drinks we had earlier. I don't know what time it was, but at some point during the night, I remember opening my eyes, confused as to what woke me up. As my senses were coming back to me, the sound of footsteps filled my ears. I sat up to listen better, and noticed my wife had already done the same. We sat there looking at each other, listening. There were multiple sets of footsteps. It sounded like no more than 20 yards away. My wife suggested we make a run for the car. I told her we should wait a few minutes. It was light out that night from the moon, and behind her I could see the silhouettes of 3 men on the tent wall. I didn't tell her this. The last thing I wanted to do was scare her. But I did get a firm grip on the machete laying next to us. Although I was horrified at the thought of actually having to use it on someone. I sat there watching the shadows. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, after what was realistically only a couple minutes, I saw them walk off. This was our chance. I told my wife it was time to go. Leaving everything behind, I opened the tent and we full-on sprinted to the car. I've never been more thankful to have a remote start key fob. I started the engine as we were running, and right as we got inside, I floored it out of there. That's when I told my wife about the shadows on the tent wall, and she laid into me for not telling her earlier. We spent the night in a hotel. The next morning, we went back to the camp. All of our stuff was gone. Not a single thing was left behind. I still don't know what really went down that night. A part of me thinks we were just unknowingly on someone else's private property, and that was their sick way of getting us off of it. But it's possible those people meant real harm to us. Either way, they now have all of our camping gear. However, I don't see us going camping again anytime soon.
Back in high school, my house had a huge backyard that was connected to a large forest. When we were kids, me and my friends would go and play games far out in the woods. There was always this small sense of danger being out there, which made things more fun. As we grew up though, we stopped going out there because there was no point. But then one day, me and my buddy Tyler were hanging out on the couch when he brought up this idea of going out into the woods late at night. Over the next few minutes, our idea evolved from just a simple walk in the woods to full-on camping overnight. Tyler said his parents had a tent we could borrow, so we walked down the street and picked it up from his garage. Now's a good time to mention that neither of us had ever been camping before, so we had no idea what we were doing. Honestly, I don't think either of us thought anything of it though, because we would only be out there for a single night. After packing a bag with a bunch of snacks, water bottles, and a portable phone charger, we set foot in the woods. We found out within the first couple minutes that the flashlight Tyler brought was really shitty, barely lighting up more than a few feet ahead. It was enough to keep us from walking into trees and bushes, but we couldn't see much else. During the first 15 minutes of walking, we talked about how excited we were and how creepy it was going to be. But then we walked for another 15 minutes without really talking. I think we were both mesmerized and a little bit spooked by the eerie silence. A couple times, I thought I heard something walking nearby, but the flashlight would never reach far enough to see anything. After our 30 minutes of walking, we found a place to set up. It was an open section of grass with trees around it. Tyler wedged the flashlight on top of a bush so that it lit up the area, and then we started setting up the tent. He said it was an easy assembled tent, but there was nothing easy about it. We probably spent an hour to get the tent to stand up without falling in on itself. It also didn't help that every time we'd hear something, we'd have to grab the flashlight out of the bush and shine it around, then set it back up and start over on the tent. I don't know about Tyler, but at this point, I was regretting coming out there. When we did eventually get the tent up though, it was a lot less stressful. We sat inside and listened to the sounds of the woods. It would be completely silent sometimes. Then a minute later, there would be birds chirping or some other animal making noises. It was a really cool experience until we both heard a more familiar sound. We stayed in the tent, listening as these footsteps made their way around the trees. They didn't sound like they were getting closer, but more like they were passing by. One thing we were both sure of was that they were human footsteps, not any other animal. After a minute they were gone, but me and Tyler stayed quiet, staring at the inside of the tent as we listened carefully. Around 10 minutes later, once we were sure whoever that was long gone, we left the tent and sat outside instead. We both felt a little too vulnerable, sitting inside there without being able to see what was going on around us. As we sat and talked for a while, that same sound started coming up in the distance. This time, it was getting closer. It eventually got so close that we were worried they were coming directly at us. Tyler shined the flashlight in the direction of the footsteps, but the sound continued. They walked toward us slowly, and just when we thought the person would come into view of the flashlight, they stopped. They sounded so close, enough for us to hear them breathing, but just barely outside of the light. Both Tyler and I were frozen, staring at the darkness beyond the flashlight. Then we heard them take one step back, and then they began walking away. A minute later, the footsteps had disappeared, and the entire woods was silent again. We undid the tent as fast as possible and immediately left. We were so shaken up, we didn't even follow the right way home, and somehow ended up on a neighboring street. We walked down to my house and stayed up the entire night in my room, talking about what happened, or what could have happened. We never stepped foot inside those woods again, and even today, I stay far away from anywhere isolated. Whoever that person was, out there alone in the woods at night, had to be up to something awful, and I think we were really close to finding out. Before I get into this next story, I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online digital security service, allowing you to scan and remove your personal data from various online sources, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers. These entities profit from your private information, making it crucial to eliminate your data from their reach. And Aura makes it as simple as possible for us to do this. With their free trial, I was registered in minutes and had Aura scan and remove my data with just a few clicks. They notified me about dozens of places all across the internet where they found my personal data, like my full name, phone number, and address. And without Aura, I never would have known. Afterwards, Aura continuously monitors my data, instantly notifying me of any issues that arise and enabling swift resolution. They also include a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, ensuring the security of all your connected devices. In today's world, personal identity and data theft are unfortunately widespread, affecting a significant number of US citizens, with millions falling victim each year, resulting in huge financial losses. With Aura, you can have the utmost confidence in your security and prevention measures. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the provided QR code. During this trial, you can discover if your personal data has been compromised, remove your data from multiple prominent platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this free trial to see if your data has been stolen and to keep your identity secure. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. I'm 28 and live in Illinois. If you've ever been here, you know this state is completely flat and doesn't have much to do in terms of hiking or camping, at least not with scenic views. This year, I tried to go camping for the first time in a secluded forest. I thought it would be the perfect starter camping trip since the land was flat and the trail was mostly a straight shot. At the end was supposed to be a small pond, so at least there would be somewhat of a nice view. The hiking part was short, being just under an hour, but the pond at the end was very underwhelming to say the least. It was very small and surrounded by swampy mush, so I had to put my tent further down into the forest where the ground was dry. I'll admit though, after an hour or two, I was really bored. I decided to get up and walk around the pond just to see what was around. I wandered to the other side, and really there wasn't much to see. It was a peaceful and beautiful forest, but there were no defining landmarks of any kind, so it was kind of just the same forest all around. I started making my way back to my camp, and by then the sun was mostly gone. I brought a small fire starter, so I used that to get a campfire going and heat up some food. But not long after sunset, I noticed a light across the pond. It was in the trees just outside of the pond, but it was right where I had walked earlier, and I knew there was nothing there just an hour ago. While it was uncomforting being out in the forest with some stranger, or possibly strangers, I knew that this was one of few camping trails around here, so the odds of it weren't too crazy. I went about my night, looking across the pond every so often. As it got darker though, this light that I thought was a campfire became more apparent, and I realized it was a flashlight, or some sort of mechanical light. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but an hour more into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye the light started dimming, and then after a few flickers, it went out. I stared at the dark and empty forest across the pond for a good 10 minutes, waiting for the light to come back up, but it never did. It gave me chills, but again, I had no idea what to make of it. The rest of the night was surprisingly quiet. I slept, and as far as I'm aware, nothing happened overnight. As the sun rose, I prepared for another walk. I was still thinking about that light I saw and really wanted some answers. I walked around to the other side of the pond where I saw the light coming from and searched around. It didn't take long for me to find the culprit, a hefty flashlight laying in the grass. The batteries were drained, but it looked pretty new, no scratches or noticeable wear and tear. I looked around some more and saw nothing else to indicate someone being here. After some thought, I decided to leave the flashlight where I found it and started heading back to my camp, but stopped in my tracks when I saw someone across the pond. They were standing by my fire pit in the middle of my camp. Then I saw another person come out of the trees and join them. It looked like two adult men, but that's all I could tell from where I was. I was too scared to yell or say anything, so I just watched as they walked around my camp and looked through my things. Then one of them stopped and turned to face the pond. He stood there, scanning the tree line where I was standing, until he was looking right at me. He only looked at me for a moment, but it sent shivers through me. I watched the man leave the camp and start walking between the trees. I lost sight of him for a moment, until I caught a glimpse of him sprinting through the forest. I ran further into the forest, away from the pond. I knew the chances of them finding me were near zero, but I was too scared to think straight. I ran for probably 15 minutes before I stopped and turned in the general direction of my car. Luckily I made it safely, but I lost everything I had. To put it shortly, nothing happened afterwards. I filed a report with the police, but it all turned to nothing. I think about that flashlight a lot though. Was it those men's, or was it someone else's? I hope the flashlight was just a ploy they used to get me away from the camp, but if it was, then why would they come after me? I keep trying to convince myself that it was just a robbery and they had no other intentions, but in my gut, I know that I likely came close to never making it out of that forest. Last year was the first time I'd ever had something happen on my camping trip. I'd go camping alone several times a year, usually going to the same spots, but sometimes I'd try and find somewhere different. For this trip, I decided on a 4-mile camping trail that I'd never been on before. I drove out 2 hours from my house to a remote location where I started the hike from. Right away, I was not enjoying the trail as much as I thought I would, mainly because some portions of it were wet and muddy. Still, I continued along and tried to avoid those spots. I went down for a while, and around 45 minutes in, I saw something off the side of the trail. It was a tent, but very worn down and had a few rips in it. From afar, I could see that nobody was inside of it, so I walked closer. There were no signs of any intentional damage. It all just seemed to be weathered over a long period of time. The fact that it was still standing up was mind-blowing to me. I looked around it and inside of it, but oddly enough, there was nothing else. I thought I'd find a bunch of stuff left behind, but there wasn't anything at all other than the tent itself. After a couple of minutes, I went back to the trail. I thought about it for a while, but couldn't come up with any good reasons to leave a tent like that. As I walked for the last hour and a half of the trail, I came across dozens of left-behind objects. All of them were camping or hiking equipment, but seeing all of this stuff scattered around a 4-mile trail gave me an uneasy feeling. Who would leave everything behind? It was definitely not an accident, and I was pretty sure it was all from one person. When I got to the end, I set up my tent a good distance away from the trail, just to be safe. It was getting dark already, so I stayed at my campsite until I was ready to sleep. I felt a bit nervous to go to bed, but I was able to sleep through the whole night without issue. When I got up, It was early in the morning, around 4 or 5, so the sun wasn't fully up yet. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, but right away, I could tell something was wrong. I turned around, and on the other side of my tent, a man stood just a few feet away. He was tall and thin, wearing disgusting clothes, and his face was covered in dirt and grime. He looked at me with this empty stare. I stood there motionless. In the moment, I was so shocked and scared, it almost didn't even seem real. "Leave," he spoke in a soft yet creepy tone. I nodded and quickly started gathering my backpack, but he immediately rushed toward me. I fell back and all I could get myself to say was "okay," repeating it over and over. The man stood over me, still with that empty look in his eyes. "Leave," he said again. I understood what he meant this time and quickly got up and rushed away, leaving everything behind. I took one look back as I got out of there, and the man was rummaging through my backpack like a curious animal. I jogged as far as I could, then fast walked the rest of the way to my car. Thank God I kept my phone and keys in my pocket, or this situation could have been 100 times worse. I drove out until I got service, then called 911. I found out that there was an almost identical case to what I experienced, but whoever filed it chose for it to not be publicly announced by the media. This was likely the person whose tent and belongings I found on the trail. After a week of talking to the police and going over everything, they were able to organize a small search party of officers. They went down the trail and came back with no sightings or evidence of the man, but they found most of my stuff nearby my campsite, tossed around like trash. After that, the case went stale, just like the previous person's. The thing I always come back to is how the man didn't keep anything. He just scattered it all around the forest with no intent of using any of it. I'm 29 and I live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. I've been going backpacking and camping for years, exploring different trails all around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lived just a few miles from me, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every year in the fall, being anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains. In the days leading up to the trip though, my friend had to call it off because of an emergency at his work. I'd already taken the whole week off of work and had everything ready to go, so I decided to just go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead, then started my route. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like you'd typically see on a 4-hour hike. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you have to use maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate where you're going. Typically there's a large landmark in the distance, like a specific rock formation that you hike toward, and when you get there you can see your next landmark, and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When it got dark on the second day, I set up camp several hours from reaching the ridge. I pitched the tent and got a fire going, then heated up some of the food I brought in my bag. The sun had already set, and it was around 8 o'clock when I laid in my tent to rest and read. I left the fire going, planning to put it out before actually sleeping. 20 minutes into reading, and through the fire crackling outside, I heard the strong sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I jolted up. My first thought was a black bear, possibly having smelled the food I cooked earlier. I didn't hear anything else though. I crawled out of the tent and shined a flashlight into the tree line behind my tent. Nothing. I called out aggressively to scare away any predators, but again, there were no sounds of anything running away. It was really strange because the stick snapping was very distinct, definitely being from something stepping on it. I stayed outside the tent for a while, looking around constantly, before putting out the fire and going inside. I found it really hard to sleep that night because I was so focused on listening for more sounds. In the morning, I was almost surprised to have even slept through the night. I packed my tent and everything else at the campsite, then continued along until I reached the ridge. From there, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast, trying to get there before dark so I wouldn't have to move my campsite again the next day. I arrived with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, very much worth the hike. I walked around it, enjoying the scenery, then pitched the tent and set up my camp on the tree line beside the lake. As I sat by the fire, I kept turning around, hearing soft noises somewhere between the trees behind me. I figured I was just being paranoid, but it was really creepy. It almost sounded exactly like footsteps, but I knew nobody would be out here. I would have seen their tent when I walked around the lake. It was too dark at this point to see anything further than a few feet, so looking around wasn't an option anymore. An hour later, I got in my tent and laid down. Every few minutes, I would hear footsteps again. They were barely too quiet for me to tell for sure what they were though. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell asleep. Then, what I think was only an hour after I fell asleep, I woke up to the sound of someone running away from my tent. I jolted up and grabbed my flashlight, rushing out of the tent and looking in the direction of the footsteps. I saw the bare back of them running away in the distance. My heart was beating rapidly. I looked down and saw footprints all around my tent like they had been walking around me and searching the campsite. I tried to get the campfire going again as fast as I could so I could see better. I was terrified. I had nowhere to go and nobody to help me. I sat at the fire all night, keeping my head on a swivel, but I never saw or heard anything else. In the morning, I snapped a few pictures of the lake, then started the hike back. I had planned to stay for a whole day. I wasn't comfortable anymore, feeling like I was being followed. I was able to make it back without any more trouble, thankfully. But, along my journey, I began noticing several things missing from my backpack. Small things like food, a few tools, etc., but I always had my bag with me. Even today, I wonder if whoever had been outside my tent that one night had actually snuck inside and stole from my bag while I was asleep. Even the thought of it makes my whole body shiver. I've always loved camping, especially in the fall when the leaves are changing colors and the air is crisp. So, when my best friend, who I'll call Katie, asked me to go camping with her for her birthday, I jumped at the chance. We packed up our gear and headed out to a secluded spot in the woods that Katie's family had been camping at for years. As we hiked in, I felt a sense of silence. In a good way though. It was like we were the only two people in the world. The hike was relatively short, and when we arrived at the campsite, we both started working on setting everything up. This only took a portion of the hour, and after we finished, we decided to go for a hike. We went pretty much straight north, off the beaten path, just exploring, until we came across a faded trail. Katie had never seen it before, and said there was nothing out here, so she was confused. We followed the trail that wound through the woods and eventually led us to what looked like an old abandoned cabin. It was small and weather-beaten, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Katie was eager to explore it, and I was a bit hesitant, but also really curious, We stepped inside. It was clear that no one had been there for years. We poked around for a while, looking for any interesting artifacts or clues about who had lived there, but we didn't find anything. As we were about to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a door in the corner of the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. It was very small and had a padlock on it. I pointed it out to Katie, and we both became curious. The lock looked really old, completely rusted all over. I knocked on the door, knowing nobody would be inside, but I just wanted to make sure. Katie went outside and grabbed a large rock, handing it to me. I smashed it against the lock, only taking a few good hits until it broke open. The door dragged against the ground as we pulled it back. Inside, it was pitch black and we couldn't see anything. Katie pointed her flashlight through the doorway, and there was a staircase leading down. We both were creeped out now, but we assured ourselves that nobody has been here for years and there really wasn't anything realistic to fear. I led the way down the steep staircase. It wasn't very long, only 8 to 10 steps, before it opened into a room. What we saw was very disturbing and strange. There were several small mattresses on the ground, along with some other random furniture. They looked very modern though, like the mattresses had to be within 5 years old. Something about it just hit me with fear, and both of us rushed upstairs. We pushed the door shut again and stood there, unsure of what we just saw. We debated whether or not it was a crime scene of some sort, because it all just looked so out of place. As I was talking, Katie suddenly shushed me. In the distance, footsteps were coming toward the cabin. They came all the way up to it, but oddly, they walked right past it without stopping. I could see confusion on Katie's face too. As soon as they were far away, we ran back to our campsite, then right back to Katie's place. We called the police, just in case it was something. To us, the fact that the person kept walking without even stopping meant that they were familiar with the cabin. We didn't know if it was due to something bad or not, so we decided to let the police decide. They searched the cabin and the area around it, but ultimately found nothing leading to anything. They said it was really strange, and even seemed like it had to be something bad, but there just wasn't anything justifying that. It ended up becoming a big thing in our town for a while, having the community talk about every possibility and theory of what the cabin was used for. The city even had the cabin torn down because they didn't want people visiting it. It still has never been figured out, and it probably never will, but there's just something in me that knows. Something awful happened there. Every year as a kid, my family would go on these big camping trips. I was always really excited because we lived in Arizona where there's pretty much nothing, and we'd camp in Washington. Seeing trees and grass was my favorite part, but I also got to see all my cousins, and even though we only saw each other a couple times a year, we were really close. My favorite cousin, who was more like a brother to me, was Luis. He was a year older than me, and we were inseparable when together. Because of what happened, we became even closer after that camping trip. I think it took us both a while to understand what really went on and what more could have happened to us. It started when we had been there for 2 days already. Most of our family was either in the lake or by the campfire talking. Luis didn't like to swim, so we decided to play in the woods instead. We played a version of tag called Bandit. We'd switch off being the cop and chase the other one who was the bandit until we'd catch them. We would play for hours, but in the woods, it's easy to just keep running and not know where you're going. We tried our best to stay within viewing distance, but when Luis started chasing me with a huge stick, I guess my adrenaline kicked into hyperspeed. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually, I ended up at an old-looking trailer. Luis wasn't far behind, but I remember him throwing the stick down, his focus now on what we both assumed was an abandoned trailer. We discussed investigating it further, and I'm not really sure why, but we decided not to. We started walking back, but we didn't really know where we were going. Probably about 10 minutes into our walk, we saw a couple coming towards us, pushing a shopping cart full of stuff. The woman approaches us and is really nice, while the man stayed back. She asked if we were lost, who we were with, our names and ages, and I remember when we told her how old we were, she looked back at the guy and then to us again. She told us we don't have to be scared, and she'll help us find our way home after they drop off their stuff at their campsite. She said we could also make s'mores if we wanted. Luis and I were hesitant, but she seemed really nice, and it was still daytime, so for some reason that made everything way less suspicious. In my 7-year-old brain, bad people only do things at night, so we were fine. We walked with them for a while, following them back to their camp. While her and Luis were talking, I glanced over at the shopping cart. It was filled with a bunch of rusty metal things, and what looked like to be nothing new. Nothing was in bags. Everything just looked like trash they'd found somewhere. I started to get really uncomfortable, and I could tell Luis was too. Every time I'd look over at the guy, he was never smiling, and sometimes he'd be staring at me with a blank stare. This was 18 years ago, and I still remember how creepy he looked. We walked a bit further until the trailer came back into view, and the woman grabbed Luis and mine's hands and asked if we were excited for s'mores. Suddenly, I heard Luis's name being called, and then mine. We all stopped for a second, and the lady squeezed my hand a bit tighter. She asked something to the guy along the lines of what they should do. He responded, but I don't remember what he said. The lady started to turn us toward the trailer while holding us tighter and tighter. She started to speed up as well, into sort of a fast walk. I looked back and saw my sister through the trees. Without hesitation, I yelled her name, and the lady immediately let go of my hand. Luis and I ran to her as she made her way towards us. My sister yelled to the others that she'd found us. My mom and dad thanked the couple who had told them this elaborate story on how they've been trying to find our parents for a while now, and that we're such sweet boys and everything. I remember my parents inviting the couple over for burgers, but thankfully they declined. I think because the lady was so nice and that we were found safe, that my parents didn't think twice. I do recall my dad and uncle talking about how creepy the guy was though. My cousin and I ended up telling my sister who found us that the couple was weird, but I don't think she understood what we meant. It wasn't until my cousin and I were old enough to understand that some people have really bad intentions. We talked about it again in depth, and we both came to the conclusion that by the looks of it, they were tight on money and were probably going to sell us or something. For years growing up, I had kept this from my parents because I was supposed to be the strong man of the family, and thinking about that time made me feel gross and preyed upon. Luis also felt embarrassed, as he was older than me and felt he had failed to protect me. We eventually told our parents a few years ago, but I wish we had told them immediately, and maybe something could have been done. Nowadays, I never let my kids out of my sight, and always let them know that they can tell me anything without fear of being judged, especially my son.